Okay, so we're going to start with lecture on page 54. We're skipping the protists and we're going to just jump right into the kingdom Animalia. Okay, so I just want to refresh your memory on phylogeny. So phylogeny, proposed evolutionary history of a species or a group of species. Okay, so it's kind of like that family tree that we talked about in previous lectures and you guys did the lab on it. Okay, so animals as a kingdom are considered to be monophyletic, which means they come from one common ancestor. Okay, so this is a phylogeny of the kingdom Animalia. Okay, so again, just to go through some of the characteristics of a phylogeny, anything that's at the tips of the branches are extant. It means there's currently living representatives. Anything that would be at these branch points below or a side branch that ended down here would be considered extinct. Okay, branch points, again, the forks indicate two things. One, common ancestor to everything above. So in this case, the mollusks, the annelids, arthropods all share a common ancestor down here. Okay, the other thing indicated by the branch point is that some kind of change took place in that ancestral population that drove organisms based on differences through natural selection into different extant groups. Okay, so when we say that animals are monophyletic, we believe that the ancestor of all the animals was this ancient protist. Okay, so we haven't talked about protists in lecture in any formal way. Protists typically uh, can be split into three broad categories: animal-like protists, plant-like protists, and then fungi-like protists. Okay, so in the animal-like protists, most of those organisms, one cell makes up the whole organism. Okay, so when we say that animals are monophyletic with an ancestral protist as an ancestor, we're talking about this organism here, which is a choanoflagellate. Okay, it's a colonial protist that had flagellated cells. So each of these individual cells on this stalk constitutes a single independent organism. Okay, I want you to kind of pay attention to this structure of this choanoflagellate because we're going to see cells that look very, very similar to this in one of the groups of animals, which is the sponges, the poriferans. Okay, so difference between colonial and multicellular. Okay, a colonial organism has multiple independent units living within a group. Within that group, if you remove one of the organisms, it can exist on its own. Okay, so when you think of animals that are colonial, uh, most people will say birds, shorebirds, or they'll say things like bees, termites, and so on. Okay, so if you think of a colony of termites, okay, each individual has its own kind of position in that group. Okay, they all work together to a common end. But if you were to take one of those termites out of the colony and give it suitable conditions, say you put it in a jar, okay, and you give it something to eat and the things that it needs, it can exist on its own. Okay, the caveat to a lot of these social insects is that their society is very highly developed, where every individual has its own kind of place in society, and if you remove them, they have trouble adapting. But for the most part, they can exist on their own. Okay, if you think of a colony of seabirds, okay, so they all cluster together to nest in a given area. If you were to take one of those birds out of the colony and kind of isolate it, put it in a cage, and give it food, water, and things it needs, it can exist on its own. Okay, a multicellular organism, you have multiple cells that function together as a unit. So each cell is interdependent on the other cells that make up the organism. Okay, so you can think of it this way: if you were to take a liver cell out of your liver and you put it in a petri dish, it would not be able to exist on its own for very long. Okay, so with these choanoflagellates, these cells, you could pop one of these cells off of this cluster and it can exist just fine on its own. Okay, so how did you get from something that was colonial to something that was multicellular? So individual cells are independent to interdependence of the cells on each other. Okay, so based on what we know about the choanoflagellates, okay, it's thought this was the progression in going from colonial to multicellular. Okay, so they exist together as a group. Okay, if you take one of these cells and you kind of pop it off, at this point in its evolutionary history, those cells can exist on their own. Okay, it's thought that they eventually, as part of their colonial nature, they formed this thing that looked like a hollow ball of cells or a hollow sphere. Okay, why do you think this cluster would take on this form? What could be a reason for that? Okay, when you have this orientation of the cells where it's hollow in the center and they're kind of pushed out to the extreme, what you're doing is you're increasing surface area. Okay, these guys, the way they get food is through intracellular digestion. So little bits of food in the water get captured and then they get brought into the cell through phagocytosis. So if you kind of expand the area over which food can be captured, is that going to be advantageous to you? Is that going to be a good thing? Sure, you'd be able to capture more food. Okay, and it's thought going from this orientation of the cells to this orientation of the cells that you start to see an interdependence on the cells for survival. Okay, so one of the trade-offs would be if you increase your surface area by expanding out, that you're going to somehow, let's say you're over on this area and you're catching the food in this orientation. If you're getting lots of food, somehow you're going to transmit some of those nutrients to other cells that aren't getting as much. Okay, so that's where an interdependence could evolve. Then over time, some of the cells become specialized. They become these reproductive cells. Okay, if the reproductive cells are important, which they would be if that's how you're going to reproduce, you may want to try and protect them a little more. Okay, so over time you would see an infolding where those cells become more protected. And then over here, you see this kind of gastrula-like organism with the reproductive cells protected on the inside. Okay, so when you look at this progression, it kind of mimics what we see in cleavage. Okay, you're starting with the zygote. You end up with, it's not in this picture, but the morula, which would be the solid ball of cells, then the hollow ball of cells, which is the blastula, and then the invaginated hollow ball of cells, which is the gastrula. Okay, so morula, blastula, gastrula. Okay, so you can see the progression of development in cleavage can be used to explain the evolutionary history of moving from colonial to multicellular. Okay, one of the key things that happens in most of the animals when they go through their development is formation of these things called germ layers. Okay, the germ layers form in the gastrulous stage. Okay, so when this hollow ball of cells in cleavage invaginates or pushes in, that's where you get distinct layers of cells. The cells start to differentiate. Okay, and a lot of that has to do with the chemical communication and the orientation of the cells in that cluster. Okay, so these germ layers are going to give rise to tissues in the adult. Okay, and there are 3 germ layers that can develop. Not all animals develop all 3. And it's actually one of the characteristics by which we initially classify animals into distinct groups. Okay, so we're going to talk about the 3 types of germ layers that can develop. Okay, first is the ectoderm, which is the outer layer of cells. Okay, so when the gastrula forms and it pushes in, you have a layer to the outside and then a layer on the inside. So the ectoderm is this outside layer here. Okay, we're going to talk about endoderm shortly. That's the inside layer. And in many animals, a 3rd layer called the mesoderm develops, and it's just an outpocketing or a branching or splitting of some of these cell populations to grow and line this internal cavity. Okay, so the ectoderm, that outer layer, typically will develop into the skin or the epidermis of the animal if they have it, and the central nervous system. Okay, not all animals have central nervous systems. Well, most animals have nerve tissue. That nervous tissue is developing from that ectoderm layer. Gonna skip mesoderm for now. Talk about endoderm. So endoderm is that inner layer. So on the picture, it was depicted in yellow. Okay, that's primarily forming the digestive tract. Okay, invertebrates, things like us, our liver and our lungs will also develop from that inner layer. Okay, and then in a certain group of animals, a third layer will develop. That's called the mesoderm. Okay, it gives rise to muscle and connective tissue. Okay, so one way to remember mesoderm and what it develops into: mesoderm starts with M, middle layer starts with M, muscle, which is one of the big tissues that forms from this layer, starts with M. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop the lecture at this point and pick up in the next